Hi friends, welcome back to Quiet Time. We're going to read Chapter 2 of Book 3, Trouble According to Humphrey. Chapter 2 starts on page 11. The Problem with Paul. Who's Paul? I don't remember that name in the other two books. Humphreyville wasn't the only thing new in room 26 that Tuesday. Once everyone was seated, after recess, Mrs. Brisbane opened the door and in walked a small boy I'd never seen before. He stood very straight and held his chin high. "Welcome, Paul," the teacher said. All of my classmates turned to stare at the boy, who stared right back at them. I craned my neck to get a good look at him. All I could tell was that Paul looked very, very serious. Do you guys think that this might be a new friend, like when Tabitha joined the class? Class, some of you might know Paul Fletcher from Miss Loomis's class. He's going to be coming into our room for our class for math every day from now on. Oh, he's just coming into their room for math class. He's a year behind us. That was Heidi Hopper, of course. Gail started to giggle but stopped herself, although I'm pretty sure Paul noticed. His chin sagged for a second. Heidi, please, Paul is an excellent math student, and Mr. Morales asked if he could sit in on our class. I expect you to treat him like any other classmate and be as helpful as possible. Some of you probably already know Paul, don't you? Mrs. Brisbane waited. Very slowly, Art raised his hand. He lives across the street from me. Art kept doodling on a piece of paper. He was a great doodler. If I doodled as much as he did, I'd fill up my whole notebook in a day. Unlike Seth, who had a hard time sitting still, Art sat quietly, but his pencil was always moving. Let's pull up a chair next to you. Here, Paul. Paul sat, though he and Art didn't look at each other. Why don't we go around the room and introduce ourselves? One by one, my classmates said their names. Gail giggled when she told her name. Richie mumbled, and Mrs. Brisbane had to say, repeat it, please, Richie. AJ said his name extra loud, and Saya said, I am Saya Nasiri. Welcome, Paul. That was nice. When they were finished, I squeaked out, and I'm Humphrey. Mrs. Brisbane laughed and said, I guess Humphrey wants to make sure you meet him too, and Og, our frog, of course. Og silently stared out of his glass house. Sometimes I wish he acted a little friendlier. Mrs. Brisbane quickly launched into math class with a difficult problem for us to work out. Everybody went to work except me. I was too busy watching Paul writing like crazy. Mrs. Brisbane walked around the room to see how each student was working out the problem. Good, Heidi. Make sure those numbers line up, she said. That's perfect, Saya. She told AJ and Tabitha to try again. When she saw Paul's answer, she smiled and said, Excellent, Paul. When she saw Art's answer, she stopped smiling and said, Needs work, Art. Try going back to that first step and starting over. I watched the two boys as the teacher did more explaining. Art hadn't done well with his problem and he looked unhappy. Paul had done really well with his problem, but he looked unhappy too. At the end of all her explaining, Mrs. Brisbane told us that we'd have a test next week and handed out a study sheet. Eek, I squeaked. I didn't mean to. I just realized that I'd been paying so much attention to Art and Paul, I hadn't listened to the teacher at all. You should always listen to your teacher. Any questions, she asked. Paul raised his hand and she called on him. What is Humphreyville? He said. It's our town we're creating for social studies. Oh, said Paul. Well, if there are no other questions, you may go, Paul. We'll see you tomorrow. Mrs. Brisbane used her especially cheery voice. Paul didn't waste any time grabbing his notebook and hurrying out of room 26. I liked Paul, but I wasn't sure that he liked room 26 very much. By the next day, Humphreyville was taking shape. My fellow students had already begun to build their homes. Oh, there were so many different kinds. AJ made a house out of blocks. He didn't care if somebody knocked it over because he could build it up again. Garth made a log cabin. Seth's house was a spaceship. Cool. Golden Miranda drew a picture of a purple castle. She deserves a castle. Heidi, true to her word, made a blue tent with pink and yellow polka dots. Saya built a tall apartment building. She said since Humphreyville would be such a popular place, we would need a lot of places for people to live. Mandy's house was very tall and narrow. She explained that each floor was for a different member of her family. Unfortunately, it kept tipping over. By far, the house that got the most attention was Art's. He used small plastic bricks, metal springs, sprockets, and things I didn't know the names of to build a house that had a big slide coming out of the attic, inner rooms that revolved like a merry-go-round, and train tracks that went right through the middle. I believe Art's house will put Humphreyville on the map, Mrs. Brisbane said. I think he's got the first A on a project that he's had all year. I sure gave him an A. When Paul came in for math class, he sat next to Art. Although they ignored each other completely, it sounds strange, but Paul looked even smaller when he walked out of room 26 than when he walked in. On Wednesday evening, I scribbled in my notebook working on the drawing of my house. It got dark early. Luckily, I could sketch by the light of the street lamp outside the window. Of course, the sound of the crickets, Og's special treats, going chirp, chirp, sometimes made it hard to concentrate. Suddenly, I was blinded by bright lights. Surprise, surprise, Aldo has arrived. My eyes adjusted to the light, and there was our friendly custodian, Aldo Amato, bowing from the waist. I quickly slipped my notebook behind my mirror. Greetings, Aldo, I shouted. I knew it came out squeak, 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 but Aldo always seemed to understand me. Hello, Humphrey, howdy do, Og? Aldo pulled his cleaning cart into the room, took out his broom, and started sweeping. He stopped as soon as he started. Mamma mia, what's all this? He asked, looking around the room. Humphreyville, I squeaked loudly. Boing, said Og. I could see how surprised Aldo was, with good reason. Since the night before, the whole room had changed. Tables with all the students' homes lined up the back of the room, and the rows between their seats had big signs on them with street names. My classmates had discussed what each street should be named. When Mrs. Brisbane suggested 1st Street, 2nd Street, and so forth, the students didn't like that idea. Then she suggested naming the streets after presidents. But my friends weren't interested in that either. We want something that stands for us, Garth said. Names that are things we like. Now the growing town of Humphreyville had Soccer Street, Basketball Avenue, Video Game Way, and Recess Lane, as well as Pizza Place and Taco Boulevard. Aldo's big black mustache bounced heartily as he laughed and looked around. Welcome to Humphreyville, a sign announced on big bright letters. That was hard for me to say. The table where Og and I live had some grassy material on it with a sign that read, Og, the Frog Nature Preserve. I was glad they named something after Og so he wouldn't be so jealous. Jealousy feels bad, bad, bad. Aldo started sweeping again. I'm lucky I get to clean Mrs. Brisbane's room every night because I learned so much about being a teacher. He had just returned to college so he could teach school, which was an excellent idea. Humphreyville, he repeated again with a chuckle. Looks like the perfect place to live. Aldo went about his work in his usual quick and efficient way, then pulled a chair up near my cage and took out his lunch bag. He always took dinner breaks with Og and I and talked about his life. He talked about his wife, Maria, who worked at the bakery and had a beautiful smile. Lately, he talked a lot about college. Whew! Humphrey, I knew that school wouldn't be easy, but it's getting harder all the time, he said. I'm lucky Maria is an understanding woman because I hardly have any free time. I haven't even been bowling in weeks. Although I wasn't completely sure I knew what bowling was, I knew it was something Aldo enjoyed. He chewed his sandwich thoughtfully for a moment. Still, it will be worth it. I can be a teacher and work with kids and maybe have a house like one of these, he said, waving toward the back tables. Like the one with the train tracks going through it. He reached in his sandwich and pulled out a piece of lettuce. Here's to your health, Humphrey. He pushed the lettuce into my cage. I squeaked a heartfelt thanks. So I don't have anything for you, Og, my man, he told the neighbor. You're a lot pickier than Humphrey. Picky? The frog eats crickets. Yuck! Not nearly as appealing as the mealworms I enjoy. Aldo hurried out the door with his squeaky cart. Although I was sorry my friend didn't have time to go bowling, I was glad he was going to be a teacher. Mrs. Brisbane, like a teacher like Mrs. Brisbane. I could hardly believe that when I first met Mrs. Brisbane, I didn't think she was a very nice person. In fact, I thought she was out to get me. Now she's one of my favorite humans, and I have a lot of favorite humans. This is our last page of chapter 2. During the next few days, my classmates worked hard building up Humphreyville. Every day, Paul came in for math class. Though he sat next to Art, his neighbor never, ever looked at him. Every day, Paul left the classroom in a big hurry. On Friday afternoon, it was time for Mrs. Brisbane to announce which student would be bringing me home for the weekend. It was always an exciting moment for my classmates, and even more exciting for me. My whiskers wiggled wildly as I waited to find out where I'd be staying. Pick me, said Mandy, frantically waving her arm. You never let me take Humphrey home. She was right. I'd been home with many of my friends, some of them even twice, but I'd never gone home with Mandy. You haven't brought back the permission slip I sent home with you, said Mrs. Brisbane. Mandy let out a huge sigh. My folks have been busy. Well, tell them I'm waiting for their signatures. Now, I believe Seth is scheduled to take Humphrey home this weekend. Sit still, Seth Stevenson was so excited he jiggled his chair until it actually tipped over. Luckily, he wasn't hurt. Try to stay calm, said Mrs. Brisbane. I will. I covered my mouth with my paws when I realized that she had been talking to Seth. I made a mistake. After all, I'm only human. I mean, only a hamster, which is a very good thing. Then our newspaper title at the end of this chapter is No Housing Shortage in Humphreyville. Building boom keeps room 26 students hopping. Population swells as Paul Fletcher joins math class. The Humphrey Herald. Have a good rest, friends. I'll see you tomorrow.